I want to continue the discussion that we were having yesterday. Right? Not yesterday. When? Monday. What did we talk about on Monday?
We talked about equality between
Revolution.
Equality, revolution, right? We talked about these new ideas that were traveling around the Atlantic world, right? And these are majorly important ideas. Well, in Latin America, right? And when I say Latin America, I mean, we never have a good map. I'm sure there's one on here. When I say Latin America, I mean Central and South America. Right? We already talked about what was going on in North America. You had British colonists rebelling against the British Empire. And they were like, no, we should be able to vote. Well, who should be able to vote in North America?
White men.
White men who owned land. Right? White men who owned land should be able to vote in North America, was the argument. Well, in France, they said, all right, you know what? All white men should be able to vote. And for a little time, they said all men in general should be able to vote. And for an even shorter time, they said women should also be able to vote. But they took away the votes for women, took away the votes for people of color in France. But then in Haiti, right, in the country that would become Haiti, the colony of Saint-Domingue, we see a revolution that says, you know what? Voting should be allowed for anybody, or for any man, right? It takes a little while for women to be able to vote in Haiti. But in the rest of Latin America, we have these racial and class divisions that are affected by Enlightenment ideas. All right? And what we're going to talk about is how those Enlightenment ideas affect society. So, what is society in Central and South America? How is it set up? At the top of society are people known as peninsulares. Right? And you're a peninsulares, or you are a peninsulare, if you come from the peninsula in Europe that holds Spain and Portugal, right? The Iberian Peninsula. If you come from the Iberian Peninsula, you are a peninsulare, right? You have moved across the Atlantic Ocean. You have established yourself in Central or South America, depending on where you are, or on one of the islands. And you have probably set up a plantation, or set up a ranch, or a farm, or a mine, or something, right? You are at the top of society. You are the elite class, if you are a peninsulare. Right below the peninsulares are the criollos, or the Creoles. Right? The criollos, they're people who are descended from peninsulares. Right? Their parents were from Spain or Portugal, but they were born in the Americas. They're like, we are Creoles. We are different than the peninsulares. In addition to the Creoles, you also have different groups of people that were characterized based on who their parents were. And we kind of mentioned this before. But below Creoles, you have mestizos, who were part Creole, part Native American. You also have mulattoes, who were part Creole, or peninsulare, I guess, and part African. And then you have Native Americans, and then you have slaves. And so that's how society is set up. You have your peninsulares and your Creoles at the top. And then below the Creoles, you also have these people known as mestizos, as they called them, and mulattoes, as they called them. And where you were depended basically on who your parents were. If you were somebody who was of African descent and of like Spanish or Portuguese descent, technically that would make you kind of towards the bottom of this social hierarchy. But the social hierarchy was pretty fluid at this time, right? It wasn't based, bless you, it wasn't based on your skin color. It wasn't based on how you appeared, right? It was based on what kind of a role you filled in society. So if you were descendant of Africans and Spanish people, right? Based on this drawing, you might be associated with kind of this towards the bottom of society. But in reality, you could basically purchase various amounts of whiteness, right? You could buy your way up in society. You could buy different titles, and this social hierarchy was not necessarily strictly defined. And it was certainly not based on skin color or anything like that. Right? So you have these different class divisions which are basically based on your heritage. And based on what your heritage is, that kind of determines where you're going to end up in society to begin with. But you can certainly change that. Well, one of the things that these class divisions were dealing with was this repartimiento system. And remember when we talked about the encomienda system? What was that?
For Native Americans.
It's for Native Americans. And what would happen to Native Americans in the encomienda system?
Treated like slaves, or they're slaves. They have to work.
Yeah, they had to work. They were like slaves. And they were a cheap labor force for all the conquistadors who had set up these new plantations. Well, the encomienda system, remember a lot of the church officials, they said, that shouldn't be. This is bad news for all the Native Americans. All these Native Americans are dying. We need to get rid of the encomienda system. Well, they replaced it with the repartimiento system. And what that system was, it was still a system of labor, right? But what it said was that not all of the Native Americans on your territory that you claim as a conquistador have to work for you, or not all of the Native Americans, you can't force them to work for you as slaves. Instead, to be a Native American person or an indigenous person in Central and South America under the rule of the Spanish government, you had to work for like 5 months, or not 5 months, 5 weeks out of the year for the government. Right? You were repartimiented or something like that. It was part of your duty as a citizen of the Spanish government in these colonies, bless you, to work for a set number of weeks throughout the year. And that work that you do would be in mines, on ranches, on plantations, and a variety of places, mostly in mining. Right? So this is what replaced the encomienda system. And people would only work for like 5 or 6 weeks out of the year, but they would still work in these terrible conditions. Right? So it's not much of an improvement, except that if you're a Native American, you don't have to work all the time as basically a slave. Instead, 5 or 6 weeks out of the year, you work alongside slaves on various projects. Well, several people do not like this. And one person in particular who doesn't like this is Tupac Amaru II. Tupac Amaru I was the last Inca emperor. Right? He died like in the 1600s. But he was the last emperor of the Inca to be resisting against the Spanish conquistadors. Tupac Amaru II, he was another Peruvian person. Right? He was somebody of mixed heritage from Peru. And what he did was lead a rebellion against Spanish policies, and specifically against the repartimiento in Peru. In Tupac Amaru's rebellion, they were able to kill 100,000 Spanish people in Peru. That is a lot of people in the 1780s. And Tupac Amaru, he gathers everybody up, and he says, you know what, we are done with the repartimiento system, and anybody who is enforcing this type of labor on indigenous people of South America, of Peru, they are wrong. We're going to rise up against them, we're going to take back our lands. And so Tupac Amaru II, he leads this indigenous resistance, and he leads this rebellion that soon encompasses not just indigenous people, but African slaves and other people of mixed heritage who are towards the bottom of society. Right? What eventually happens is that news of Tupac Amaru's rebellion spreads throughout Latin America. People hear about it. Right? And especially Spanish officials and Portuguese officials, they do not want that to happen where they live.